Thank you for coming, and welcome to Stone Masonry for Masons. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Morgan Dummett. I'm a sculptor living and working here in Philadelphia. I work in traditional materials, primarily clay, stone, and bronze. I'm a figurative sculptor, meaning that I sculpt primarily people, either in the full figure or portrait busts. I started my training across the street at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and have also apprenticed with a variety of stone carvers and other artists. I'm not a Freemason, but as we will discuss, I am a Mason of sorts. The purpose of our talk today will be to look at the technical side of the many wonderful sculptural and decorative crafts on display here at the Masonic Lodge. I'll talk for about 30 minutes and then open up for any questions. But let's start with a little bit of context. Why, we might ask, is this building called the Masonic Library if none of its adherents are Masons? Although the word masonry refers to the practice of shaping stone, few, if any, members of modern Masonic lodges are Masons in the literal sense of the word. So as to avoid confusion, from here on out, when I refer to masonry, I mean the traditional craft of stone carving. And when I say Freemasonry, I mean the modern society of free and accepted Masons. For the latter free and accepted Masons, the dividers, square, triangle, and plumb line are invoked according to their symbolic rather than practical meanings. The compass might represent the relationship of the individual to the society rather than a simple drafting tool. How did modern Freemasonry develop from a guild of craftspeople working stone hundreds of years ago to the philosophically minded brotherhood of today? In tracing this evolution, we might easily conclude that the original definition of masonry has been entirely lost to contemporary Freemasonry in anything but a symbolic sense. Yet I propose that this is a misleading conclusion. Much of this talk will be devoted to explaining the various architectural and sculptural crafts on display in Philadelphia's Masonic Library. The more we understand the technical difficulties of these trades, the more we will understand that we are standing amidst a menagerie of traditional crafts practiced at their absolute pinnacle. This building incorporates the diverse arts of stone masonry, stone carving, wood carving, carpentry, plaster and bronze casting, faux finishing, gilding, figurative sculpture, abstract design, as well as oil painting, mosaic, and many more. We will see that this lodge is as much a library of sculptural and decorative techniques as it is a library of texts and ideas. While the simple stonemasons of the 14th century appear to have given way to the speculative or accepted masons of the modern era, the very stones of this building stand as a living testament to their legacy and continuing role in defining Freemasonry, craft, and creative ingenuity in the 21st century. Let's begin by following these medieval stonemasons who gave rise, over the centuries, to the institution we call modern Freemasonry. While I may be an expert in sculpture, I am certainly not an expert in Freemasonic history, and much of this information is still being debated by historians far more erudite than I am. As of the 15th century, we have the earliest written distinction between Masons and Freemasons. While a Mason is undisputedly a word describing a worker in stone, the etymology of Freemason is far less straightforward. Freemasons may have been, literally, free masons. That is, stonemasons, not indentured, and free to travel and practice their craft. It may be that masons who worked on ecclesiastical properties were free from taxation and other local government regulations, and were in this sense free. Freemasons may also have been workers of free stone, meaning stone with a tight enough grain to be worked in any direction, and therefore suitable for more elaborate, ornamental, or sculptural applications. Freemasons would in this case have been finer craftspeople than ordinary masons, who worked primarily on the quarrying and crude shaping of building stones. At any rate, by the early 17th century, the latter definition had come into accepted use. The term mason referred to minimally educated hewers of stone, while a smaller portion of craftsmen were called Freemasons, educated in geometry, design, and the more precise and artistic applications of the stone carver's art. Masons of any description were parts of the guild system, which governed trade workers between the 11th and 16th centuries. Workers were ranked according to experience, from apprentices to journeymen and the highest title, Master Mason. At this point, the Masons were little more or less than a highly organized and regulated group of craftspeople, encompassing quarrymen as well as the sculptors of the early Renaissance. While their tools, dividers, triangles, and so on may appear esoteric to the modern eye, they were nothing more arcane than the tools of their trade. The sea change, the shift away from practical craftsmen, little educated beyond the demands of their careers, comes in the 18th century. The early 18th century sees the creation of the first Masonic lodges. Research remains divided on the impetus for their transformation from simple tool sheds to larger, more elaborate centers of community. During this time period, general membership in Masonic guilds seems to have increased, and it is possible that lodges simply increased in scale accordingly. Owing to the dangerous nature of the work, lodges may have grown out of necessity into places for the care of injured craftsmen, and eventually provided for the widows and children of those killed on the job. It may also be that the preponderance of religious wars in the 17th century left many Masons without guild halls or codified building permissions, and that these craftspeople reorganized their communities around Masonic lodges. Here in the slide, we see the first Masonic lodge built in America, St. John's in Boston. At any rate, these lodges soon attracted men who were not stonemasons for the community they provided. And I say men intentionally. With very few exceptions, all Masons in the pre-modern and modern era are male. These men were considered accepted or speculative Masons, whereas the practicing stonecutters were practical or operative Masons. Accepted Masons could be from any class, disregarding the strict social hierarchy that was normative at this time. It is speculated that the modern Freemasonic value of taking good men and making them better originates with the presence of upper-class men rubbing shoulders with lower-class Masons in the same lodge. Accepted Masons began borrowing the tools of practical Masonry and imbuing them with symbolic meanings and moral lessons with which modern Masons are familiar. Aprons, guild handshakes, and other practical elements of the stoneworking guilds were reframed as emblems of a fraternity of ideas, rather than literal craftsmen, while the free in free and accepted Masons still refers to the Freemasonic craftsmen from the beginning of our discussion. By the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of Masons were of the speculative branch. In the slide, we see the stained glass portraits of FDR and Truman in Philadelphia's library, dressed in aprons and holding tools, though of course we are not meant to understand that they actually used them to carve stone. The craft of stone carving has become the vestigial tale of Freemasonry, still visible in the body of the organization, but functioning only as a signifier of a bygone and outmoded Masonic community. Bringing things back to the present, as we all know, symbols and signs tend to become invisible. If you write "do not eat" on your leftovers in the fridge, it practically guarantees that your roommate, spouse, or child will do so. While the Masonic Lodge here in Philadelphia is replete with the signatures of countless master craftsmen in its stonework, painted and gilt interiors, and sculptural decoration, it is easy enough to stop really seeing them for what they are. I will now turn to an overview of these traditional crafts. In understanding their complexities and the skill involved in creating every inch of this building, I hope that we will see the Masonic Library anew. Each time we re-engage with a piece of art in the library, we are honoring the master craftsman who created it and renewing its relevance in our experience of Freemasonry. We are bringing the hammer and chisel, or the compass and plumb line, out of esoterica and into our daily lives. I'll begin by talking about the most obvious craft, at least etymologically, masonry. The line between stone masonry and stone carving for sculpture is blurry, but for our purposes, stone masonry involves the shaping of stone for construction and decorative purposes. This might be anything from squaring a block for building a wall to carving the decorative top of a capital, as can be seen in wonderful profusion in the entrance to the library. Whatever the shape is, stone masonry involves taking a rough block of stone, be it limestone, granite, marble, or otherwise, and reducing it from a crude mass into ever more refined geometric shapes. Like most fine arts, masonry involves moving from the broad to the specific, saving fine details until after the overall shape has been achieved. In order to understand how masons progress from this broad shaping to fine details, I'd like to introduce the various tools that the mason uses to shape stone. Carving starts not with hammers and chisels, but with a set of tools that have changed very little since ancient Egypt, the feathers and wedges. These devices are used to split large stones into manageable blocks of the approximate dimensions required for a project. First, a series of holes are drilled into the stone mass in a straight line. Then the feathers and wedges are inserted into the hole in a precise manner as shown. The feathers sit alongside the wedges such that when the top of the wedge is tapped with a hammer, the feathers are driven into the stone, applying considerable pressure. After a series of gentle taps that drive the wedges slowly into the holes, the stone reliably cleaves along the intended line. The next tool that the mason uses is the pitch. This is a broad-headed chisel with a thick, wide cutting head, far more coarsely shaped than any other chisel. The pitch is used to further reduce the block to its desired shape by rapidly removing large amounts of material. The mason draws a straight line on the block and delivers a series of sharp blows with the pitch. A fault line is created, and large amounts of stone are easily removed. Once the pitch has been used, the block may be nearly finished. All that remains is cleaning up the inch or so of irregular surface that it leaves behind. Depending on the job, no further finishing may be required. For example, masons building mortarless stone walls deploy the pitch alone with great skill to cut each stone precisely into shape. If a smoother or more regular surface is required, the mason moves on to a variety of chisels, working from coarse to fine. Here, a brief look at the simple physics of a hammer and chisel is instructive, as they dictate the shape of the various chisels. A hammer hits the striking head of a chisel, and the force travels down the chisel to the cutting head and into the stone. The shape of the chisel's cutting head determines its effect on the stone. If the entire chisel comes to a single point, all of the force of the hammer is forced into one minute spot for a maximum of stone removal. We can see a point chisel in the center of this slide. Here we can see a portrait bust, roughed out with only the point chisel. Unless otherwise noted, all work illustrating artistic processes is my own. If the cutting head is divided into more than one point, the force of the same hammer blow will remove less stone, but the removal is more easily controlled and articulated. In the next chisel, shown, the claw chisel, the cutting edge is divided into a series of points or teeth. The more teeth, the less stone is removed. While the two-toothed dog's tooth will remove a great deal of material, smaller tooth chisels with blunted teeth may be used for careful modeling of small forms. By following the point chisel with a series of claw chisels, the mason generally finishes shaping the stone. The only thing left to do is to remove the grooves left behind by the claw. This is achieved with a flat chisel, shown on the left, which removes very little material, but leaves behind a relatively clean, unified surface. On a soft stone, like limestone, this is usually the last step. In harder stone, like marble or granite, files and rasps may be used to further refine the surface. Abrasives, like sandstone, emery, and pumice, may be used to impart a shiny polish. This series of tools, from the pitch to final finishing with abrasives, is used whether the mason is making a simple square block or a finely carved statue. Even if a sculptor is carving a highly detailed figure or design, the tools are more or less the same. Here we come to the second art form I'd like to discuss today, the creation of sculpture in stone. Like I said, the line between sculpture and masonry is so blurry as to be practically meaningless. For example, take the heads of these columns from the front of the Masonic library. The design is regular and geometric, though finished with a high degree of decoration. It requires both the mathematical precision of the stonemason and the freer, more organic carving skills of the sculptor. A project like this might traditionally be roughly shaped by masons before being finished off by a sculptor, but in reality, either craftsperson would be qualified to complete this sort of project. In most cases, however, stonemasons are not responsible for creating statuary, certainly not formally sophisticated statues of people like this marble figure in the museum, or the highly articulated lion's head on the second floor. Stone sculptors arrive at their forms in one of two ways, directly or indirectly. The direct carver is more akin to a mason, in that his only tools are those which we have just discussed. The direct carver draws the outline of the sculpture on the stone, and then proceeds to carve, largely according to drawings, plans, or the imagination. The columns pictured in the previous slide were very likely carved directly. While highly precise results can be achieved by direct carving, direct carvings often have a certain whimsy and flexibility, as the direct carver often changes his design as it is revealed to him through the action of carving. Virtually all carving between the fall of Rome and the late Gothic was direct, and stunning examples can be seen in the Masonic Museum and around the world. The other mode of carving is indirect carving. The indirect carver first models his forms in clay and then transfers them precisely into stone. The obvious advantage is that clay is a far more forgiving material than stone. A very sensitive shape, like a portrait of a particular person, or a delicately modeled figure, can be arrived at after endlessly pushing the clay using wooden and metal tools. The sculptor can change their mind, add on, and remove without the stonemason's fear of cutting off too much. Once the delicately modeled bust is completed, the sculptor knows exactly what forms he is to carve, as the clay model serves as an extremely precise guide. The clay is preserved in plaster, and then a tool called a pointing machine is used to transfer hundreds of precise measurements from the plaster to the stone. While it is called a machine, the pointing machine is nothing more mechanical than a precisely articulated brass measuring apparatus. Let's quickly look through the various stages of using the pointing machine. First, we have the creation of a finished clay model on the left. Next, the pointing machine is set up on an appropriately sized block. Next, the piece is roughed out with the point chisel. Eventually, we start taking points on the surface, revealing the majority of the sculpture. The surface is then finished with flat chisels and rasps, and the sculpture is completed. As we can see, the final sculpture is extremely close to the original plaster, to a degree that would not be possible if directly carving from a drawing. Moving on from stone carving, let's look at a craft that is in many ways similar, wood carving. The Masonic Library has several stunning life-sized wood carvings, although most are painted white to resemble marble, a practice common in the 19th century. Conceptually, wood carving is similar to stone carving, in that either one directly carves from a drawing or indirectly from a carefully prepared plaster model. Interestingly, because wood was historically a less valuable and less durable medium, wood carving has traditionally been practiced directly, which is faster and less costly as it does not require the creation of a preparatory plaster model. Here we see several highly accomplished wood carvings on the second floor, several by William Rush, a co-founder of the nearby Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. From a practical point of view, wood carving varies greatly from stone carving. The primary difference is that wood is composed of rows of organic fibers, while stone is composed of countless tiny mineral crystals. Stone carving chisels mash these crystals to remove them, while wood carving chisels actually slice or cut through the comparatively soft wood fibers. As we can see here, stone carving chisels are far blunter than wood carving chisels, which must be kept literally razor sharp. While the action of a stone carving chisel is dependent almost entirely upon the division of points along the cutting edge, as previously described, wood carving chisels are all flat-ended, in that they have a flat edge which is constantly in contact with the wood. What varies is the size and profile of the tool end, which may be anywhere from a broad crescent to a tight U or V shape. Chisels are driven by a heavy wooden mallet for rough carving, but because wood is so much softer than stone, they may be driven by hand for smaller details. As in stone carving, Wood carvings may be finished with rasps and abrasives like sandpaper, but are often left with a tooled finish. In summary, wood carving is quite similar to stone carving in principle, but the material demands a very different execution. Sculpture production can be roughly divided into two approaches, casting and carving. In carving, the final sculptural material is present throughout the process. The mason starts with a stone block and ends up with a stone carving. In cast sculpture, a pliable material like clay or wax is carefully modeled into the desired shape. Plaster molds are then made on these impermanent materials and filled with other, more durable substances such as plaster or bronze. Let's next look at the mold making process to see how a sculpture in clay winds up as a finished bronze sculpture, or the humbler cast plasters we see in this slide from the Masonic Library, all by the great French sculptor Houdon. The art of clay modeling is extremely rich and deep, and incorporates the skills of drawing, observation, anatomy, gesture, rhythm, and other skills common to a variety of artistic pursuits. The sculptor models the clay or wax with a variety of wooden tools and rakes. When the modeling is completed, a plaster mold must be made to facilitate casting in a permanent medium. As anyone who has made a clay pot in school will know, clay dries out and becomes brittle if not kept damp, and as such is not a permanent or durable material. While not nearly as hard as stone or bronze, plaster is at least stable, and if undisturbed, will last indefinitely. Before discussing mold making, let's differentiate between the mold and the casting. They are easily confused, especially when we are talking about a plaster mold used to create a plaster casting. The mold is a negative impression of the sculpture traditionally made of plaster. While we use flexible rubber molds today, all of the castings in the Masonic Library are made from plaster molds, so this is what I will focus on. The casting, or positive, is the sculpture itself, made by pouring liquid plaster, wax, or other materials into the negative mold. The mold is removed, leaving behind a positive casting. Traditionally, plaster casting requires two phases of mold making, the waste mold and the piece mold. The waste mold is a one-time use mold, while the piece mold can be used many times. The waste mold is made by painting plaster directly onto a finished clay surface. The freshly mixed plaster is as thin as milk and captures every detail of the sculpture. When it has hardened, the negative mold is removed from the clay model, which is discarded. The mold is reassembled and filled with fresh plaster to produce our plaster casting. As we can see in the middle of the slide, the mold is chipped off, leaving behind a perfect positive casting of the clay original. Because the mold is chipped off of the plaster casting and discarded, it is called a waste mold. The plaster casting is now refined and finished using steel tools. On the right, we see the finished plaster casting. Plaster is far softer than wood or stone, and is shaped more with fine rasps than with hammers and chisels. Any seam lines from the mold, the waste mold, must be cleaned off, air bubbles filled, and then the sculpture may be sanded, filed, or otherwise perfected. Now we have a single plaster casting. This can be where the process stops, but if one wants to make multiple plaster castings or bronze castings, a second, more complex piece mold must be made on the plaster casting created via the waste molding process. A plaster piece mold is essentially a jigsaw of plaster pieces that are formed around a sculpture. They can be removed from a rigid plaster casting without damaging. So, any place where a piece would snag on the sculpture, a second piece must be made to facilitate removal. As you can see in the picture, anywhere that the waste mold would snag on a casting, another piece is created. A piece mold of a portrait bust might easily have 20 pieces, depending on the sculpture's complexity. The plaster is divided up via the creation of clay walls, and each piece of the mold is created individually. When all the pieces have been created, they are housed in a larger plaster shell or mother mold, which holds them in place during the casting process. This piece mold can now be filled with plaster, and instead of being destroyed like the waste mold, it is simply removed piece by piece and reassembled, ready to be filled for the next casting. This is how all of the plaster busts on display in the museum were made. If this sounds complicated, it is nothing compared with the creation of a bronze sculpture. The Masonic library is full of beautiful bronze objects, from functional objects like this lamp to a variety of sculptures in relief and the round. A bronze casting starts with the aforementioned sequence of clay model, waste mold, and then piece mold. This is because the first step in bronze casting is to pour hot wax into a piece mold to create a wax casting of the intended sculpture. Because the wax is delicate, a piece mold is required to safely remove the casting. What's more, the wax casting for bronze is always hollow, unless the piece is very small, which makes it even more delicate. If we tried to remove a wax casting from a waste mold, it would shatter. Why do we want a wax casting if the final material is to be bronze? Why don't we just pour bronze right into the plaster mold? While bronze casting sounds wildly iterative, it's actually the fastest means of meeting the specific needs of metal casting. First, we need a mold which can withstand the 2100 degrees required for bronze to pour properly. If we poured bronze into a plaster mold, the mold would be destroyed. So, we need to make a mold out of a material which can withstand the considerable heat of bronze casting. For this, we use liquid ceramic, which can be fired and made to withstand the bronze pour. The second demand of bronze casting follows the first. The ceramic mold must be made over a material which can be easily melted out, leaving a cavity for the bronze to fill. Wax is perfect for this, as it is easily cast and manipulated, but can be completely liquefied and drained while the ceramic is fired. While we could make a ceramic mold over the original plaster casting, there would be no way to remove it without breaking the ceramic shell. Built over a thin wax casting, the ceramic mold is fired and the wax evacuates through small holes or vents, and bronze can be safely poured into the cavity left behind. Here we see a sculpture cast in red wax. It is cut into several sections, and a system of wax bars is created to deliver bronze to all parts of the sculpture, as well as facilitate the draining of wax from the ceramic mold. On the left, we see a variety of those wax channels. On the right, we see the production of ceramic molds over the wax casting. When the wax is melted out, we are ready to pour bronze. When the metal has cooled, castings must be cleaned, ground, and filed to perfection, and in larger sculptures, various sections need to be welded together. Here we see some of that work in progress. Finally, a chemical patina is applied at high heat to create the brown, green, or black coloration that we usually see on finished bronze sculptures. It would be difficult to discuss traditional craft in the Masonic library without touching upon faux or false finishing and gilding. Famously, many of the rooms in the library are elaborately painted to resemble other materials, from stone to wood to gold. The level of skill and attention to detail is nothing short of astounding. While I don't have time here to go into how each of these painted surfaces is achieved, we can in general discuss what is involved in treating plaster to look like something else. The first problem the faux finisher faces is that the plaster is extremely porous. If one is to paint over it, especially in oil, it must be first sealed to prevent the paint from being absorbed unevenly. This is traditionally achieved by painting the wall with size, glue, or shellac. These substances fill the pores in the plaster and allow smooth application of color. Here are just a few more painted walls in the Masonic library, the quality and variety of which are really unlike anything I've seen elsewhere. Many surfaces in the library are not only painted, but gilt, that is covered in an extremely thin layer of gold leaf. Gold leaf is real gold that has been beaten so that it is thinner than tissue paper. Gilding leaves the impression that the object, whether a sculpture or piece of architectural decoration, is partially or entirely composed of gold. In reality, it is usually made of a far cheaper material like plaster, wood, or even bronze. Again, the substrate must be sealed, in this case with a gilder's primer. which both seals the plaster and provides a warm undertone. Traditionally, gilding primer is either red or yellow. The gold is so thin that the undertone shines through, and in the event that the gold is ever scratched or damaged, a pleasing warm underlayer is revealed, rather than a harsh spot of bright white plaster. When the primer is dry, the gold leaves are attached using an oil-based adhesive called gilding size. Gold leaves are only a few inches wide and extremely fragile. Any larger, and they would tear under their own weight. A broad squirrel's hair brush called a gilder's tip is used to pick up the leaves and transfer them to the primed surface. The leaves are so light that the static charge between the brush and the leaf is enough to hold them to the gilder's tip. If the brush runs out of static electricity, the gilder simply rubs it vigorously in their hair, and static charge is created. After the surface is entirely covered in gold leaf, any overlapping or extra leaf is brushed away, and the surface can be burnished to bring out the luster of the gold. Here we can see someone, not me, applying gold leaf with a gilder's tip. You can see how thin the leaves are, and the red primer where the leaf has not yet been added. We have now covered stone and wood carving, plaster and bronze casting, and touched on faux finishing, yet we have barely scratched the surface of the vast array of crafts practiced in the creation of the Masonic Lodge. We have said nothing of the world-class oil paintings or the incredible mosaics and stained glass, but we're running out of time. It would take days to account for every inch of human ingenuity which came together to build this incredible space. I'd like to wind down our talk by taking a new look at the front hall of the lodge, with an eye for appreciating the astonishing array of craft excellence on display. Everyone walking into the lodge sees this partition. You pass it on your way to the central staircase, the ballroom, or the library. You might walk past it without realizing the symphony of arts on display, and this is surely not the most inherently striking area of the museum. Let's start with the bottom and work our way up. This richly carved marble basin started life as a rough block and was carefully carved, probably directly, from a coarse pitch to fine abrasive polishing. Above that, we have this elaborately carved and gilt wooden cherub. Again, the cherub started out as a log and was carefully carved before being finished with gold leaf. Passing by the beautifully designed tile work, we come to a wooden arch intricately carved with foliage patterns. On the mezzanine level are 3 stunning gilt bronze bas-relief sculptures. These began as masterfully modeled clay sculptures. They were cast in plaster, first via the waste mold and then the piece mold. Waxes were cast, ceramic molds built, and the wax burned out. Bronze was heated in a furnace to over 2,000 degrees and poured. The metal was meticulously finished, and again, a thin layer of gold was applied. The reliefs are flanked by complex wooden carvings of the human figure. In this one spot, we see all of the arts I have discussed, and many more besides. If so much can be said of this particular panel, let alone the entire museum, how can we think that modern masonry is divorced from the master craftsmen who founded it? While I have expanded my consideration of craft beyond stone masonry, artisans working in various trades discussed would have been fellow craftspeople working towards the construction of beautiful buildings and objects. While we may think of their tools and aprons as largely vestigial, they are with us every time we stroll through the Masonic library. A sense of solemn, nearly sacred profundity pervades the halls of such a beautiful building. And whatever one's spiritual leanings, I believe that it is in large part created by the halls themselves, by the fingerprints of the craftspeople who labored over every inch of them. As we walk these halls, we are interacting with their legacy, and, in a sense, keeping it alive through our engagement. We are paying homage to the master masons of the past, and in doing so, enshrining and renewing their role in modern Freemasonry. Thank you. That's the end of the talk, and if there are any questions, I will invite you to ask them. Don't all rush up at once.
I actually have a question. Can you talk a little bit more? It seems like, and I know you touched on this, but it seems like you can tell when a sculpture has been done via direct versus indirect carving. Can you talk a little more about how you can tell that just by looking?
Yeah, you can never tell for certain. In general, the more regular, the more easily made as a two-dimensional template a sculpture would be, the more likely it is to have been directly carved. And the more sophisticated the forms are, the more likely it is to have been based on a clay model and then carved indirectly. But you would have to have a lot of experience with carving to be able to tell with any degree of accuracy which one it was.
Thank you.
I had a question. You mentioned earlier those busts by Houdon that we have copies of upstairs. We were told that the original Franklin bust was done in red terracotta. Is that like a decent medium?
Yeah, that's terracotta is just terracotta means cooked earth, and it's just fired clay. So it started out as clay, which would be modeled as though you were going to proceed in any way, and then it was fired in a kiln, and then after that they made a piece mold of many pieces on top of that. So it's just clay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, it seems as though there are no further questions. So thank you everyone for coming.